The bustling streets were filled with hurried footsteps and muted chatter as people rushed about their day. Among them sat a homeless man, his clothes worn and his hands trembling as he clutched a paper cup. Most passers-by barely spared him a glance, but one woman stopped briefly, tossing a few dollars into the cup. She hurried away, not noticing that her expensive diamond ring had slipped from her finger into the cup. Hours later, the man would make a decision that would change both their lives forever. The homeless man, whose name was Carl, sat slouched against the cold brick wall of a busy shopping district. The paper cup in his hands rattled faintly with the sound of a few coins and crumpled bills. His eyes stayed low, avoiding the judgmental glances of passers-by. A kind-looking woman in her late 30s stopped briefly, digging into her purse. "Here you go," she said softly, tossing a few dollars into the cup before hurrying off. Carl barely looked up, muttering a quiet, "Thank you." As the evening wore on, the crowds thinned, and Carl decided to count what little money he'd collected. He emptied the cup onto the sidewalk, and his breath caught when something shiny rolled out with the coins and crumpled bills. It was a ring, a large, sparkling diamond, set in a band of what looked like white gold. Carl's rough hands held the ring up to the dim streetlight, his heart pounding. Even with his limited knowledge of jewelry, he knew this wasn't some cheap trinket. It was worth something, probably worth a lot. His mind raced. Who had dropped it? He thought back to the woman who had tossed the bills into his cup. She had been in such a rush, she must not have noticed the ring slipping off her finger. Carl looked around, as if expecting her to reappear, but the street was almost empty now. He pocketed the ring, unsure of what to do. A mixture of guilt and temptation gnawed at him as he packed up his few belongings and shuffled toward the shelter where he usually spent his nights. "Just hold on to it for now," he muttered to himself. "Figure it out tomorrow." The next morning, Carl sat on the edge of his cot at the shelter, turning the ring over in his hands. The sunlight streaming through the window made the diamond sparkle even brighter, and Carl's heart raced as he thought about what it could mean for him. "This could be my ticket out," he whispered to himself. "I could finally stop sleeping on the streets." But as much as the thought of selling the ring tempted him, Carl couldn't shake the memory of the woman who had dropped it. She hadn't been rude or dismissive like so many others. She had stopped, looked at him, and offered what she could. It wasn't much, but it had felt kind. Later that day, Carl walked through the city, his worn shoes scuffing against the pavement. He passed storefronts filled with glittering displays, their shiny newness mocking his shabby appearance. Eventually, he stopped outside a small, grimy jewelry shop with a faded sign above the door. Carl knew the place by reputation, a black shop, where no questions were asked about the origins of the items brought in. Carl hesitated before pushing the door open, the bell above it jingling softly. The jeweler, a sharp-eyed man with a calculating smile, looked up from behind the counter. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice smooth and practiced. Carl pulled the ring from his pocket and set it on the counter. "How much is this worth?" The jeweler's eyes widened briefly before he picked up the ring, inspecting it under a magnifying glass. "This is quality," he said, his tone impressed. "I'll give you $4,000 for it." Cash. Carl's breath caught. $4,000. It was more money than he'd seen in years. With that kind of cash, he could buy new clothes, rent a small apartment, maybe even start fresh. But as the jeweler reached for the cash register, Carl froze. The woman's face flashed in his mind, her quiet kindness as she dropped a few dollars into his cup. And then, another memory surfaced. A phrase his mother had always told him when he was younger. "What goes around, comes around." Carl sighed, shaking his head. "I can't do it," he said, pulling the ring back toward him. The jeweler frowned. "You sure about that? You won't get a better offer." "I'm sure," Carl said firmly, turning and walking out the door before he could change his mind. Carl stepped back into the bright daylight, the jeweler's tempting offer still echoing in his ears. $4,000 could have changed everything, but deep down, he knew the ring wasn't his to sell. It belonged to the woman who had shown him kindness, a rare gesture in his life, and he couldn't betray that. Clutching the ring in his hand, Carl made a decision. He would find her, no matter how long it took. The problem was, he barely remembered what she looked like. His memory of her was fleeting, brown hair, kind eyes, and a hurried step. The bustling city streets were filled with thousands of people like her. How was he supposed to find one stranger in a sea of faces? Carl began by returning to the spot where he had been sitting the day before. He watched as crowds flowed by, his eyes scanning for anyone who resembled her. Hours passed, and the chill of the evening began to creep in. But Carl didn't give up. He tried asking the nearby shopkeepers if they had seen her. Most gave him skeptical looks, shaking their heads. "We don't pay attention to every customer," one cashier said dismissively. Deflated but determined, Carl decided to change his approach. He spent the next few days sitting in the same spot, holding a small sign he had scrawled with a marker. "Looking for the woman who dropped a ring. Please stop if it's you." Some people stopped out of curiosity, but none of them were the woman he was looking for. The rejection was discouraging, but Carl couldn't shake the phrase that kept replaying in his mind. What goes around, comes around. On the third day, just as Carl was starting to lose hope, a familiar voice called out to him. "Excuse me, are you looking for me?" Carl looked up, and there she was, the woman with the kind eyes and hurried step. She was holding a cup of coffee, her brow furrowed in confusion as she read his sign. "You're the man from the other day, right? The one with the cup?" Carl stood quickly, his heart pounding. "Yes," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I think this belongs to you." He held out the ring, and her eyes widened in shock as she covered her mouth with her free hand. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I didn't even realize it was missing." The woman stared at the ring in Carl's hand, her face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "I thought I'd lost this forever," she said softly, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. "This ring, it belonged to my grandmother. It's priceless to me." Carl smiled faintly, his heart lighter now that the ring was back where it belonged. "I figured it must have been important. It slipped into my cup when you gave me some money." The woman's eyes welled with tears. "And you didn't sell it? You could have gotten so much for this." Carl shrugged, though his decision hadn't been easy. "I thought about it," he admitted, "but it didn't feel right. You helped me, even if it was just a couple of bucks. The least I could do was return this." The woman blinked back her tears and smiled, her expression filled with warmth. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "Not everyone would have done what you did. What's your name?" "Carl," he said, suddenly self-conscious. I'm just trying to get by." "Well, Carl," the woman said, slipping the ring back onto her finger, "you've done something extraordinary today, and I'm not going to forget it." Carl waved off her gratitude, uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm just glad you got it back," he said. "That's what matters." But the woman shook her head. "No, this isn't just about the ring. It's about what you did, the honesty, the kindness. You didn't have to do this, but you chose to. That says a lot about you." Carl wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to praise, let alone being called kind. "I just figured it was the right thing to do," he said simply. The woman smiled again, but this time there was a spark of determination in her eyes. "Carl, you've inspired me, and I think it's time someone does something for you." He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," she said, her smile widening. "Just trust me." Carl left the encounter with the woman feeling lighter, though he couldn't quite understand her parting words. "Just trust me," she had said. He shrugged it off, assuming she was just being polite. After all, what could a woman like her possibly do for someone like him? For the next few days, Carl returned to his usual routine, sitting on the corner with his paper cup, hoping for a few dollars to get through the day. But something strange started to happen. More and more people stopped to talk to him, dropping money into his cup with encouraging smiles. "Thank you for what you did," one man said, handing him a $20 bill. Carl stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You're the guy who returned the ring, right?" the man replied. "It's all over social media. You're a hero." Carl blinked, stunned. "Social media?" The man nodded. "The woman whose ring you returned, she posted about you. Said you reminded her that there's still good in the world." Carl didn't have a phone, let alone access to social media, but he began to notice more people stopping to talk to him, some even snapping pictures with him. The kindness he had shown was rippling outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. Then, one afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up to the corner where Carl sat. The window rolled down, and the woman stepped out, her smile warm and genuine. "Carl," she said, approaching him, "we need to talk." Carl stood, his nerves kicking in. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," she said quickly. In fact, I have something to show you. She handed him a tablet, and Carl's eyes widened as he saw the page open to a fundraising campaign. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Help Carl rebuild his life. A true act of kindness deserves to be repaid." Carl scrolled through the page, his hands shaking. The description detailed his story, the returned ring, his honesty, and his current situation. The campaign had already raised over $200,000, and the number was climbing by the second. "I started this after you gave me back the ring," the woman explained. "I wanted people to know about the good you've done, and to give you a chance to start fresh." Carl's voice caught in his throat. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use this to turn your life around," she said, her smile widening. "You deserve it." Carl stared at the screen, his eyes wide as he watched the numbers on the fundraising campaign climb higher with every passing second. It felt surreal. Just days ago, he had been sitting in the cold, hoping for enough change to buy a meal. Now, the kindness of strangers was offering him something he hadn't dared to dream of, a second chance. "I don't know how to thank you," Carl finally managed, his voice trembling. It's unbelievable." The woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Carl. This is because of you. Your honesty, your kindness, it inspired all of this. People saw the goodness in you, and they wanted to help." Carl nodded slowly, still overwhelmed. "What do I do now?" "You start by taking the first step," the woman said. "This money is meant to help you rebuild, get yourself a place to live, some clothes, and maybe even look into work you'd enjoy. You've got a clean slate, Carl. Use it." The reality of it all began to sink in. For the first time in years, Carl felt hope, real, tangible hope. "I've spent so long just surviving," he said quietly. "I don't even know what it feels like to live." The woman smiled warmly. "Then it's time you find out." Over the next few days, Carl worked with the woman to access the funds and plan his next steps. He used part of the money to rent a modest apartment where he could finally sleep in a warm bed instead of on cold concrete. He bought clothes that fit him properly and allowed himself small comforts he hadn't experienced in years, a hot meal, a quiet evening, without fear of being moved along by authorities. But Carl didn't stop there. Inspired by the kindness shown to him, he began brainstorming ways to give back. He wanted to make sure that others who were struggling could experience the same generosity that had turned his life around. Carl's life was transforming in ways he had never imagined, but he couldn't shake the thought of the people he had left behind, the ones still sitting on the cold sidewalks, holding out paper cups and hoping for kindness. He knew their pain too well, and he couldn't ignore it now that he had the chance to help. One morning, as Carl sat in his small but cozy apartment, he made a decision. "What goes around comes around," he murmured to himself, the words that had guided him during his darkest moment. It was time to pay forward the kindness he had been shown. Carl reached out to the woman who had started the fundraiser, sharing his idea with her. "I want to use part of the money to help others," he said. "People who are where I used to be." The woman's face lit up. "That's an incredible idea, Carl. How do you want to start?" Together, they came up with a plan to create care packages filled with essentials: food, toiletries, blankets, and small notes of encouragement. Carl took to the streets he once called home, handing out the packages to anyone in need. The recipients were often stunned by his generosity, but Carl always said the same thing. "Someone helped me when I needed it. Now it's my turn." The story of Carl's kindness quickly gained traction again, with local news outlets covering his efforts. Donations to the original fundraiser began pouring in once more, as people were inspired by Carl's decision to share his good fortune with others. One afternoon, while delivering care packages, Carl encountered an old friend from the shelter. The man, thin and weathered, looked up in surprise. "Carl, is that you?" "It's me," Carl said with a smile, handing him a package. "And now it's your turn for a little help." His friend stared at him, tears filling his eyes. "You've changed, Carl." Carl shook his head. "No, I've just been given a chance, and I want to make sure others get one too." Word about Carl's mission spread quickly, and soon people from all walks of life began reaching out to support his efforts. Volunteers joined him on the streets to distribute care packages, and local businesses started donating supplies. What had begun as a simple act of gratitude was turning into a movement of compassion. Carl found himself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but he remained humble. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," he said during an interview with a local news station. "If I can help even one person feel seen and valued, it's worth it." The woman who had started the fundraiser stood by his side, now more of a friend than a benefactor. She helped him organize larger initiatives, including free meals for the homeless and workshops aimed at helping them regain stability. Together, they brought hope to people who had long given up on finding it. One day, as Carl was overseeing a community event, a young boy approached him, clutching a crumpled dollar bill. "I want to help," the boy said, handing Carl the bill with a shy smile. Carl crouched down, his eyes warm. "That's very kind of you," he said. "But you don't need to give me money. Just being here and caring, that's enough." The boy looked up at him, his expression serious. "But my mom said what you're doing is really important. I want to help people too." Carl's heart swelled as he accepted the dollar, knowing it wasn't about the money. It was about the spirit of giving. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're making a big difference." The moment stayed with Carl long after the event ended. It reminded him that kindness was contagious, and even the smallest acts could create ripples that reached far beyond what anyone could imagine. As the months passed, Carl's life transformed completely. The fundraiser that had started with a single act of kindness now totaled over $450,000. With the support of the woman who had inspired the campaign, Carl used the money wisely. He purchased a modest but comfortable house, his very first home, a place where he could finally feel safe and at peace. Walking through the empty rooms for the first time, Carl was overcome with emotion. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of how far he had come. From the cold streets to a warm home filled with possibilities, the change felt like a dream. But Carl wasn't done. Determined to keep giving back, he established a small nonprofit with the help of his new network of supporters. The organization focused on providing resources to the homeless, from meals and clothing to job training and housing assistance. Carl's vision was clear. He wanted to create the same opportunities for others that he had been given. The nonprofit gained traction quickly, with donations and volunteers pouring in from across the city. Local media continued to follow Carl's journey, and his story inspired countless others to take action in their own communities. At a grand opening event for the nonprofit's new headquarters, Carl stood in front of a crowd of supporters. The woman who had started it all stood beside him, smiling proudly. Carl took the microphone, his voice steady but emotional. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he began. "A year ago, I was just trying to survive. But one act of kindness reminded me that there's still good in the world, and now it's my turn to pass that kindness on." The crowd erupted into applause, and Carl felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. The ring he had returned had become so much more than an object. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could lead to something extraordinary. Carl's journey came full circle as his nonprofit became a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten by society. People from all walks of life came to Carl's organization, not just for help, but for inspiration. His story of resilience and kindness touched countless hearts, proving that one act of honesty could ripple out to create incredible change. Months after the nonprofit's launch, Carl invited the woman who had started the fundraiser to his new home for dinner. As they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by warmth and laughter, Carl looked around the room and shook his head in disbelief. "Sometimes I still wake up and think it's all a dream," he said. "But then I remember everything it took to get here. All the people who believed in me." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "It all started because you chose to do the right thing, Carl. You reminded me, and so many others, that kindness is never wasted." Carl leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," he said. "When I held that ring in my hand, I felt like I had a choice, to take an easy way out or to do what I knew was right. I didn't know it would lead to all of this, but I'm glad I chose the harder path." The woman nodded. "And because of that choice, you didn't just change your own life. You've changed the lives of so many others." Later that evening, as Carl stood on his porch watching the sunset, he thought about the phrase his mother used to say, "What goes around, comes around." He had lived it, seen it, and now he was living proof of its truth. Carl's life wasn't just rebuilt. it was renewed. He had turned a moment of temptation into a legacy of hope, and in doing so, he had found a purpose greater than himself. What started as a small act of honesty had blossomed into a testament to the power of kindness and the extraordinary impact it could have. This story shows us that even the smallest act of kindness can lead to life-changing transformations. Have you ever seen a small decision create a big impact? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales.